Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video, I'd like to discuss why so many people seem to think there might be a general election this year, maybe even in the first half of the year. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So, political predictions are, of course, a mug's game. Ruling anything in or out, even with the most careful reasoning, is likely to see you with egg on your face, particularly over the last few years in British politics. I learned this in 2021. I had a crack at a number of predictions at the start of that year. They did not go well. So now I don't bother. There are still some things you can be confident about. I'm fairly sure that the Conservatives will not oust Rishi Sunak and try a different leader before the next election. It's not just that having four leaders inside the same parliament with a large majority would be quite insane, but there's just nobody left. Like Penny Mordaunt, she looked like a potential outside bet after the first leadership contest this year, but she was a very distant also ran for the second, so she couldn't unite the party. The majority of Tory MPs simply have no one else, no one to back if Sunak can't do it. So I am happy to predict that when they replace Rishi Sunak as leader, it will be in opposition. But nor does that mean that the Conservatives are backing Sunak as their great hope either. And this is where the thinking about a potential snap general election sooner than you may think comes from. Just to be clear, I have said for a while, I do think a general election in 2023 is possible, just not likely. But the reason for this is simple enough. In order to trigger a general election before the end of next year, a majority of MPs need to vote for it. That's it. That is the only way. The only way. If almost all Tory MPs decide, no, we're not going to do this, it's not going to happen for 2 years. Almost all opposition MPs would vote for it, of course, but you would still need some Conservative MPs to do so as well. Triggering a general election under the current circumstances means that Tories would almost certainly lose. So their party would lose power and a great many of their MPs would lose their seats. And they may lose a lot of seats. In fact, I don't foresee a time now when they can trigger an election with a good chance of winning. So why might they ever vote for an early election at all? Why not just string it out until the end? Well, strategically, if you don't think you can get the party into shape to win the next election, and I don't know whether they think that or not, but if they think to themselves, we are definitely going to lose by some margin, then you turn your attention to minimising the losses. If Conservative strategists, whether the real strategists or the MPs who think they're strategists, think that they're going to lose a general election in 2024 by a greater margin than in 2023, well, then you go for the election in 2023. It's less damaging. It allows you to eye up building up for a return to power sooner rather than later. And it wouldn't need the wider Conservative Party to think this. In theory, if maybe 40 or 50 Tory MPs became so convinced that it was in their interest somehow to force a general election as being preferable to limping on with an impotent leader, then we could get that election this year. I don't think it's credible that we'll get it in a few months. I've seen some people going, oh, it could happen within a few months, like March or something. I'm thinking, I'm not sure there's any great pressure to do so within the Conservative Parliamentary Party. But Mark Drakeford, who's Labour's Welsh First Minister, he's been saying that he's put Welsh Labour on a general election footing because he thinks that the government is so weak now that it could be overwhelmed at any moment. Now, the reasoning is fairly sound. Well, it's in line with what I've said in the past, so I would think so anyway. Drakeford made the point that Sunak had to pull a couple of what he called relatively modest policies. This was for house building targets and onshore wind projects. Sunak had to U-turn on both of them, due to resistance amongst his own MPs. And the point being made is, if Sunak can't even whip his MPs to support something fairly run-of-the-mill like that, how on earth is he going to manage much more controversial policies? Remember that what an MP thinks about a policy is largely neither here nor there when it comes to how they vote. They vote the way their leader tells them to vote in almost all cases. Yes, there are rebels in all parties. Maybe not the Green Party, they've only got one MP. But generally speaking, yes, you may get rebels from time to time, particularly in the larger parties. But a Prime Minister with a large majority, as Sunak has, should be able to whip the vast majority into voting for his legislation. And there is some really controversial legislation coming up this year. The big one in my sights is the EU Retained Law Revocation and Reform Bill. Now, I'm not saying this is going to split the party down the middle, but it will split it in a way that will genuinely jeopardise Sunak's position. And the timing could be very important as well. I don't expect a general election this summer, but I do anticipate Sunak being weakened by the local elections which will take place then. However, if there is it's technically spring, it's in May. But if there is a general election this May, it will be because a major flashpoint occurs in the next couple of months. If Sunak is unable to delay dealing with any number of the ticking time bombs that he's got in his in-tray before spring, then yes, he could find himself in the same position as Boris Johnson last summer when significant numbers of ministers resigned their positions, making it impossible for him to govern. Now, it wouldn't even need such extreme action with Sunak. If he cannot win votes in Parliament, it doesn't just weaken his own position, but the public will see the Conservative Party in chaos. They will see that they're simply occupying the position of government, but not actually governing. Like I said earlier, the way you get a general election this year is by convincing enough Conservative MPs that they will suffer greater losses if they leave it until later. Make them think that their best shot at it is like a particular point this year and they will vote for it. Or enough of them will anyway. Also makes sense for Labour as well as other parties to get themselves on an election footing because we simply do not know when the election comes. It's all right saying, well, I don't think an election this year is likely, but it is possible. It's credibly possible. And when we do find out when the election is going to be, you get like a few weeks, you get less than 2 months before the polls open. In fact, a recent article was reporting that Labour worked on a manifesto last summer, just in case the Tories completely imploded over getting rid of Boris Johnson and called an election. Just as with the idea of an election this year, it was unlikely. At the time, it was unlikely, but it was possible. And Labour did not fancy getting caught out, so they wanted to be ready for it. And the same's true here. We're not saying that Drakeford's got Welsh Labour ready because he thinks there's going to be an election in a few months, but because there could be. When I see suggestions that there could be a general election within, say, March, April, I just think that's really very unlikely. But it is possible, so best to be prepared. And if there is to be an election this year, autumn or winter even is still the most likely time. I don't think Sunak is impressing as a political operator, but I do think he will avoid a major showdown with his own party this winter. He is frantically hitting all the buttons that keep the various factions happy, or at least together. He will avoid major confrontation as long as possible. But the one he cannot avoid is the local elections in May. He is unlikely to engineer a strong set of results. So what he's going to have to do is win the perception battle. He's going to need to sell the results as he will make losses. He'll just have to sell it as, well, typical midterm losses that all governments make, even though it won't actually be true. Just as last year, when the Tory client media tried to predict that Boris Johnson would lose more seats than they even had. Conservatives are on for a massive hiding. They're going to lose this number of seats. It's like, they don't even have that many seats to lose, be real. So that when the real results came out, they actually looked good by comparison. Oh, they didn't lose nearly as many seats. Oh, well done, Boris Johnson. Well done. Rishi Sunak will be hoping to do the same thing this year. He'll try to prepare people for a wholly unrealistic, apocalyptic failure. And when the actual failure is merely cataclysmic, he can claim that he turned it around and, given time, will do even better for the general election. Groups like Peter Cruddas' Conservative Democratic Organisation, they will push for the opposite, however. They will want to suggest that the results when they come in are worse than would have been the case with Boris Johnson in charge. Because I'll make another ill-advised prediction here. The Tories are going to lose more seats in the local elections this year than in last year's. Now, that's not a prediction. That is actually going to happen. Labour already had most of the seats that were up for grabs last year. That they made any significant gains at all was fairly impressive. But the seats up for grabs this year represent ones that Labour really should have. You know, when the same seats were up for grabs 4 years ago, Labour did really badly. It was in that 2019 summertime when Brexit was all going to hell in a handbasket. Labour did stunningly badly in those local elections. And in other words, 2023, when you looked ahead, was always the year when a resurgent Labour Party would expect to make massive gains. 2023 is the lodestone. But when you need to pay, careful attention to British politics, in order to realise the difference between what is realistic in each year, you have to pay careful attention. And most of the general public don't do that. They don't think in those terms. And the likes of Cruddas, along with Boris Johnson's other groupies, will happily draw false equivalence between this year's local elections and last year's. If Sunak loses more seats, and he will, they will proclaim it as absolute proof that Sunak is a poorer performer in election campaigns than Boris Johnson at the height of the Partygate scandal. They will say, Boris Johnson was embroiled in scandal at this time and he still made fewer losses than you did when there's no great scandal surrounding you. So even if Sunak dodges major battles with his MPs before May, there is going to be a Tory civil war over the local election results. The Tory media will be absolutely crucial in this because they are the propaganda machine. Right now, they tend to split between backing Sunak as the only credible bulwark against an actual government and undermining him because they don't think he's given them what they want and they want to topple him. If Sunak doesn't win over the Tory media entire before May, it is likely to be quite a bloody encounter. And if there is to be a fatal collapse in his authority, and it is an if, we don't know that it will be, but if there is to be, to the point where it becomes obvious that he will not be able to govern, that is when I think we're going to hear credible talk of a general election. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. I hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please click the like button. If you'd like to support the channel further, the join button for memberships. And until next time, I'll see you later.